Um, so yeah, he's raised as a prince of Egypt, right? He's in Pharaoh's household, Pharaoh's daughter's household. Um, what's next? He's rejected by his people, right? He decides that he is going to step forward and be the leader of the nation. He is still identifies with the Hebrews because of his mom. And so he decides he's going to step forward and be the leader, and Israel rejects him. So where does he go next? Leads to the wilderness, and the wilderness is the wilderness of Midian. And then while he's in Midian, what's the next thing that occurs? The thing that's 40 years he's out there learning how to be a shepherd. Do you think all those years as a shepherd benefited Moses while he was leading Israel? Yeah, absolutely it did, for a lot of the same reasons. The burning bush commissions his change. Where did the burning bush take place? Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it took place on the top of Mount Horeb, or on Mount Horeb. And another name for Mount Horeb is Mount Sinai, which to me is kind of a cool little, it's sort of like Mount Moriah with its sacrifice of Isaac and then the crucifixion. There's those nice little reminders that the Lord builds into his narrative. All right, so the burning bush, he now, instead of the self-appointed leader, is actually really hesitant, but he finally, after God rebukes him, goes back, and the next event that happens in the Exodus, man.
You need to work on your animations.
I need to work on that. Okay. So yeah, so next is the animation. I mean, not the animations, the
10 plagues.
The 10 plagues, thank you, Zachary, which finally, after Pharaoh's pride is broken for a moment, he releases Egypt, or it releases Israel, and they come to the Red Sea, and there's a crossing of the Red Sea, the trip to Sinai, the trip to Kadesh, which is where we are tonight, spies sin into the land, and then Israel refuses to go. I was looking back over all this afternoon, and I thought about one of the quotes we had last week from the Waldron book, where it said how different their history could have been, right? 2 to 3 months making this trip. God was ready to give them the land. He was ready to fulfill the second promise, right? They added an extra 40 years of wandering in the wilderness because of their disobedience.
I hear that statement. I think about our life, and I think about the power of the present. How we stand throughout our life at different crossroads with decisions to make. And I mean, maybe your life is spiraling. The power of the present is you can make things right. You can be right with God, so that you don't have to look. Here we know how their story is going to end. They're going to wander in the wilderness till they die. And right now in this moment, we can choose to just be devoted to God, to seek the Lord. And no matter how badly we may have messed up life, we can get back on track. And our story does not have to have a bad ending. The power of the present, the choice that we make. We don't want to look back at the end of our life, how different my life might have been. Those decisions are made in the moment that we have right now.
Well, it's one of those things that's such a huge takeaway. They had a moment, and this, unlike some big moments don't look like big moments, right? Some big moments look like ordinary moments, and then you look back at them and realize they were huge moments. This moment looked like a big moment, and they crumbled in the face of it. So let's talk a little bit about that. But before that, let's pretend for a moment that you're a golfer, and you come up to the fairway, and this is your tee box. What are your thoughts about, if you're standing at the tee box, what are your thoughts about your next shot? What goes through your head? What? Lucky if I'll get past the third tree.
Water, sand,
yeah,
all kind of traps.
And I don't know if anybody in here is a golfer, but I was thinking about this with some of the research I was reading to get ready for tonight. when that picture first popped up, what did your eye get drawn to? Ma'am? The what? The black. Okay, Leslie's eye got drawn to the little black ball. I don't know what that is. I guess that's a T marker, maybe. That's interesting. Okay, Leslie's an outlier. She's not helping my point. Dennis? The hazards, right? Like the first thing you see is the tree or the sand traps. And if anybody in here has ever played golf and you come up where there's water or there's trees and the last thing you think before you start that swing is please don't hit it in the water. Where's that ball going? Guaranteed, right? Like you might as well just take it and throw it in the water. Okay, so that's illustration one. The picture on the left, raise your hand if you would be willing to walk across that 12-inch board unassisted. Everybody? 12 inches wide, right? Actually, it's probably 11 and a half inches wide, but you know. What about if that same board was put up on top of that erection, that building? Anybody want to walk across that? Okay, Luke wants to walk across that. It's the same situation. What's different? But Luke Manning, how many times could you walk across that board in a row without falling off? The one on the left. Several, right? We could probably walk across that thing all day and wouldn't fall off very much if we did. How many times could you walk across that other board without falling off?
Nuts.
Yeah, you only got to fall off one. It doesn't really matter beyond that. But man, can you imagine that feeling of standing where that dude's foot is and just thinking, right? So as I was getting ready for this, I was reading some stuff about negativity bias. And if you take an evolutionary standpoint, which I hope nobody here does, it would argue that it was a response as mankind evolved. When the saber-toothed tiger wanted to eat you, you had to be careful of warnings and fears to protect yourself. And obviously, I don't believe that. But it is true that our brain activity responds. There's higher brain activity to negative stimuli than there is to positive. And psychologists call that a negative bias, that we are prone to see sand traps and trees and water rather than there's really more green space out there than there is anything else, right? All you got to do is hit it in the space between the trees and you're fine. And if you think about that, it's really true, right? I jotted down a couple of things. You ever gone into like your work evaluation or something like that, and you get all good marks, and there's one area where it's marked and needs improvement? What do you walk out of that remembering? Right? Doesn't that hang in your mind? You stand up and have to give a presentation at work or something like that. You do a great job, and there's one thing where you forget to adjust the animation and it doesn't go right. What goes through your mind?
Messed that up, ruined it.
Yeah. We hang on hurtful things people say. We may have a relationship with somebody for years, and one hurtful interaction with them, we'll hang on to that for years sometimes, right? And then actually, I think David Banning mentioned it when he was here too. But what's the expression? This is a terrible question to ask a group of people. What's the expression in media regarding negative news coverage? And I realize I'm asking you to jump in my brain here. Anybody ever heard the expression, if it bleeds, it leads? Right? Media, particularly national media, it plays on that idea, right? We are drawn to negative. It captures our attention in a way that positive doesn't. I think, Luke, in a class a while back, you talked about it takes like 20 positives to offset a negative. That's what we're talking about. And in a lot of ways, I think that principle plays into what happens to Israel on a national level here. Because that negativity bias, yeah, maybe it does protect us from danger, because I'm not walking across that board on the right. But a negative outlook, a negative view will also kill gratitude, won't it? It makes me look at the things I don't have instead of the things I do have. Eve. It changes how I view other people, right? It weakens relationships, and ultimately, and I think this is the jumping off point for tonight, a negative mindset, that negativity bias can erode trust. It can erode trust in each other, but in this case, I think it erodes trust in the Lord. And that's an actionable thing we can all take out of here. So with that, Zachary, you want to jump in?
Yep. So as Joel had mentioned, this is a very significant event going on tonight. This is the linking story between the end of the Exodus and the beginning of the wandering in the wilderness. So Israel has been commissioned to go into the land, and God's going to go before them. I mean, this has to be a time of great excitement for them. I mean, God had promised them, Abraham, and this had been handed down from father to son and from generation to generation. And so, each generation had to be hoping, well, we hope we're going to be the generation that gets to enter the promised land. I mean, for us, it might be akin to thinking Jesus is going to come back at some point in time. Man, I hope it's going to be during my lifetime. I hope it's going to be during my generation when that final promise is fulfilled. You think of the promised land. And so it's finally all coming to a head. And so this should be one of the fulfillment of God's promise, one of God's promise, a land promise, one of the most exciting times of their life, and it's just going to end in a nightmare kind of way because of their response to it. One of the things that I kind of found interesting, there's an account in Deuteronomy chapter 1, 3 verses there. We're not going to read that. But this sending spies into the land, I've always thought that was God's idea. As it turns out, the people went and requested to Moses, hey, can we send spies? Will you commission spies to go into the land? And certainly God sanctions the mission, because that's what we read about in Numbers chapter 13. It sounds like God sanctioned this, but as it turns out, he's just responding to the people's request to send spies. So they come and say, hey, let us go check it out. And God says, okay, here's how I want you to do it. One man a leader from each tribe to go. As it turns out, this was a rather unnecessary event. If again, it could have been advantageous for them. They could have gone into the land and, as Moses is going to tell them, brought back some of the fruit. They could have saw the bounty there, and really could have just hyped them up all the more and created all the more excitement. But in Ezekiel 26, kind of prophetically retelling these events, God speaks to Ezekiel, says, on that day I swore to them that I would bring them out of the land of Egypt into a land that I had searched out for them. Okay, this land has already been seen by God, searched out by God. He condescends to allow the spies to go. And obviously he knew that all of this was going to happen, but I just kind of found it interesting when you read the parallel account in Deuteronomy to find out that this was the people's idea, and God allows them to do that. And in verses 4 through 14, verses like we have a tendency to skip over, you have there kind of the mention of the names. So you have one tribal leader, one man from each tribe that's sent into the land as a spy. And I checked this because this isn't the first time leaders from the individual tribes have been mentioned. Back in chapters 1, 2, 7, and 10, there are lists of tribal leaders' names. And as it turns out, this is a different group of men. And you can probably understand why that would be. It's not the word for an older man. This would be the word for a younger man. Joshua and Caleb, two of the young men. I think it's safe to say that Caleb would have been probably in his mid-40s. He's 85 when they finally go into the land. And so if they wander for 40 years, that puts him early to mid-40s, somewhere in that range. So this was a younger man's work. However, it was a prestigious man from each tribe that was chosen to go into the land and just to spy things out. And I just find the fact that the names of the spies being listed are interesting. You kind of just have a tendency to gloss over that. But several things. One, they give historical element of accuracy to the narrative. If this were some insignificant event, or this were being made up, or just a moral story, what's the point of listing these men by name? And two, their names are going to be memorialized in Israel's history. It didn't have to be for bad, but as it turns out, these men could have been seen as heroes. Hey, they were the first ones to have set foot in the promised land, and so quite the opportunity lies before them. And just as we've seen failure memorialized at Taberah and Kibroth Hattava previously, where they were complaining and plagues came down and fire came down, so this event's going to be memorialized as well. And then lastly, God cares about names. You think about that. The name that we have in a book, in his book of life, our names are written there, and so God cares about names. And just some significant lessons about what oftentimes is an insignificant text in our mind. And one last thing about verse 16 that I noticed is Joshua's name is changed by Moses. It's changed from Hosea to Joshua. Hosea means salvation, and Joshua means the Lord saves. And when you think about Joshua being the one that's going to lead them into the promised land, that's a very appropriate name rather than pointing to perhaps himself as salvation. His name points to God as the Savior of the people. So those are just some things that jumped out at me in the text. Joel, do you have anything in there that kind of stood out?
Well, I mean, the only thing I would add to that is I think it's interesting, the passage in Deuteronomy, it says that it pleased Moses. And so I think Moses had every expectation that they were going to go in and find the land to be exactly what God had promised. And it was. And that they would come back and they would be give a good report. So I think he was surprised.
This could have been a very hype. This could have been a hype event that would have excited the people. Should have excited the people about the good that lay before them. And like I said, the fulfillment of all that God had promised. So.
Yeah. So there's several different maps and variations, but I do think it's worth noting. I don't know as a kid that I necessarily appreciated that they went the full length of the land, but they went from the very bottom in the Negev and around Hebron, and they go all the way up to Rahab. And so they're able to come back and search out the full scope of the land. Again, with the marching orders that Moses gave them, he tells them to go see if the people are strong or weak, if they're few or many. If the land is good or bad, if there are encampments or fortified cities, or is it rich or poor? Is it full of forest or is it bare? He knew the answer to those things already, right? So it was an encouragement for them to go verify the truth. I think wrapped up in verse 20, I may be jumping a little bit ahead, but he says to them, be of good courage. What did Moses expect to get back from their trip up, their 40 days in the land? He expected encouragement. You got anything you want to add to that, Ron? Click the next one. And then I thought it was interesting. Where did they encounter the giants? In the Negev. Where is the Negev? Yeah, it's the very southern part. That's also where they collect the cluster of grapes that's so rich they have to carry it on a pole with two people. Now, I don't know about y'all, but when I was a kid, I thought they were giant grapes. Did anybody else think that? I'm just the only one. Okay, what a surprise. But it wasn't that. It was such an abundant land that the cluster of grapes was huge. This was a promise of God keeping his word, right? God's faithful.
This wasn't an exaggeration. I got a quote from Adam Clark, who was an old, I think a Methodist writer of a commentary, a lot of us know. He said, I myself once cut down a bunch of grapes nearly 20 pounds in weight. Those who live in cold climates can scarcely have any conception to what perfection both grapes and other fruits grow in climates that are warm and where the soul is suitable to them. And I've always, maybe I didn't think they were huge, but I kind of thought that was an exaggeration, But I mean, as it turns out, that wasn't the case. This was truly a land that was blessed by God, that he had prepared for his people.
Well, and so the things I read, they encountered the giants specifically in and around Hebron, which had formerly been called Kirjath Arba. Arba was the greatest among the Anakims. So, and I may be incorrect about this, but my sense is they went all the way up to the top of the country, and they were on their way back out when they encountered the giants. Think about how many things they must have seen that were good. And I mean, there were fortified cities, but the giants came at the end of the journey when they were almost there. And that's the thing that struck fear in them. But you think about the things they saw prior to that, right? They saw 10 plagues. They saw the Red Sea parted. They saw a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. And sometimes I think we think of that pillar of cloud as this fluffy white thing that was just kind of out there like a little teddy bear. That pillar of cloud put people in awe when it rested in front of the tabernacle, right? It was a sign of God's power and his presence with the people. They saw the events on Sinai. They saw Moses' face when he came down from the mountain. They saw the glory of the Lord fill the tabernacle. The giants shouldn't have been anything that struck fear in them, but it did. And so it became a reason for doubting, and then that doubting became a reason for grumbling, and then that grumbling became a reason for what? Yeah, for rebellion, really, right?
So there's an interesting, a couple things I'd like to talk about from this section. Verse 25 gives us an important detail. How long were the spies in the land of Canaan? 40 days, yeah, 40 days. It's going to be significant a little bit later on. You're going to see a number of ironies in this event, from the details about them going, from the complaints that they made, the specific complaints that they made, to the judgment that's finally meted out on them. You think about 40 days, that number pops up on multiple occasions throughout Scripture, and it seems to be indicative of a time of testing. First occasion probably that comes to mind is 40 days and nights that it rains. We think of 40 days here in the wilderness. We think of Jesus' 40 days as he goes on the mountain to be tempted by the devil. And so this was really a time of testing for the people. It didn't have to go this way. It could have been a test that they could pass, but unfortunately it's not going to be one that they do. And they come back and they make the report to Moses in verse 27. And interestingly, all of the people were gathered together as well. So you would think if he would have known what they were going to bring back a negative report, he wouldn't have had everybody there. You don't want everybody to be intimidated, but unfortunately, everybody's gathered to hear the news. And in verse 27, they say, we've seen the land, and it's just as God promised it was going to be. It's a land that's flowing with milk and honey. However, and they shouldn't have stopped there. However, the people of the land are strong. The cities are large and fortified. The land is filled with giants. The land is full, and there's no room for us. And if you just think about this didn't have to be bad news. This could have been true, factual information, but the angle from which they tell it, there's a response that they're wanting to create within the people. You know, this was set up for them to be able, just think of the wondrous deeds that this generation could have told their children and their grandchildren. Yeah, there were giants in the land. Yeah, there were fortified cities, but God went before us. God drove them out. God gave us victory. We shouldn't have been able to win. And this might have had, like Joel's quoted that statement, how very different it might have been. They might have been able to tell these as wonderful, faith-building, historical pasts that God had done for them to their children, but instead they all they do is just they doubt and they're afraid. And God had promised them victory, and it wasn't like they didn't have a precedent to look back on, as has been mentioned. And you kind of think about that, and a lesson I draw from that is it's a defeatist mentality has no place in the life of a believer. And that's what they had. They had this defeatist mentality. They were defeated before the battle even began. And we can think about that, and it's easy to have that in our own life as well. I can't overcome this temptation, so what's the point in trying? Or the church isn't ever going to grow. We can't cause the church to grow, or we can't get the church to grow. We can't help the church to grow, or nobody wants to hear the gospel. And if you have those kind of defeatist mentalities and this outlook, this pessimistic outlook on life, then I mean that just has no place in the life of the believer, because that's inevitably what's going to happen if that's the approach that you have on things. Al?
Yeah, this is one of the saddest chapters, I think, in the history of Israel, leaving Egypt and entering the Promised Land. But you can understand, I'm not trying to deny, but you can understand why Israel felt that way. Here are the leaders say that it's not just John Doe or whoever. These are the leaders that were specifically chosen to go in the land. And they're coming back. Well, if the leader says that, if President Trump, for example, says we cannot solve this issue, then that's defeatist, and it won't get solved. I think that's what they've done here.
Yeah, I think so. And we're going to see the way that God handles the leader a little bit later on. The significant responsibility that's placed on their shoulders because of the ability to influence. And that's what's going to happen. You know, if they would have brought back words of hope and encouragement and faith, then chances are the people would have fallen in line with them. And that's so much emphasis is placed on leadership because of the influence that it's able to have. And they might have used that for good, but rather they use it to discourage people.
Well, I was
ma'am.
gonna think-
I can imagine that all people were there, and if they were, I can't imagine that many of them all signing the petition. There had to be some of them in that congregation or that group of people that did not agree with the petition.
Joshua and Caleb.
And we know of
Now,
two.
Well, we'll get to,
That's the leaders,
we're-
I mean, the people that.
we're gonna get to, chapter 14 is gonna, talk on that a little bit more. I would agree with you. If you think about the size of the people, okay, there probably weren't millions of them that were there.
I don't even think they could all heard.
Yeah.
what was going on in
Yeah,
front.
logistically, that probably wouldn't have been, but it would seem like at least, chapter 14 is going to say all the congregation, right, as there was with the loud cry. So we know that there were more than just the spies, just Moses and Aaron. There seemed to have been maybe it was a contingent from each tribe that was sent, to represent. So, I mean, easily you could have been looking at hundreds of people, but the people were sent as a representative to Al's point, that while it was the 10 spies that brought back, and we're kind of jumping ahead a little bit, brought back the negative news, Scripture, Moses wants us to understand this was also a collective rebellion. This wasn't just the leadership has done it, but rather this is a collective rebellion. In verses 1 through 10 of chapter 14, the phrase "all the congregation" in verse 1, talking about their response, their doubting, their grumbling about the situation. All the congregation, all the people of Israel in verse 2, the whole congregation in verse 2, all the congregation in verse 7, all the congregation, all the children of Israel. And so Moses wants us to understand that this wasn't the response of the minority, but this seems to be the response of the majority. And certainly God in his dealing with them understands that this seems to reflect the heart of the nation as a whole. And I think probably what we've seen thus far is indicative of the fact that had every man been given a chance to have been there, that would have been the response. Certainly in God's dealing with them, we know that he was fair and he would have punished the people that would have been willing to go if, there were just few rebels that didn't agree.
Well, and I think there's an application too. If nothing else, we need to be careful about our own complaining and criticism, because that's incredibly influential. We saw that Sunday night too with the riffraff that were complaining about the meat. They had a huge influence on a tremendous number of people, and so I think that's an application for us that we can't control.
One or two people inside a congregation that wants to sow strife and division can cause great harm to a group. And so, yes, when we find ourselves in those positions where we're dissatisfied, that doesn't necessarily mean we should maybe remain silent, but we need to be careful in the way that we communicate that, because of the influence that it can have, the leavening effect of such an act. So verses 30 through 33, you have anything on that?
Well, just that they come back, and it's interesting to me that in that quoting, it in verses 27 and 28, it truly flows with milk and honey. That's a quote from Exodus 3, where God promises them that he's going to bring them into a land, and it's the same word. They quote God to promote rebellion. And so they say it's a land that flows with milk and honey, but then they go through this progression where you see them, it's a land that flows with milk and honey, but it's a land that devours its inhabitants. And then it ends in verse 33 with, we're like grasshoppers in their sight. No wonder the people were full of fear. I mean, that's a scary proposition.
Like, what I see in all of this is like a lot of them forgetting what they're protecting while they're going.
Forgetting what God's done for them, right? And how if they would have remembered that, then they would have been afraid of the giants. Dennis, did you have a comment?
Yeah, can't advocate
That kind of goes back to what Joel was saying.
I can walk across that board all day long if it's on a cinder block, but if you put it up 40 stories,
the difference in
they believed God.
That's exactly right. There was no mention of God in their report.
saying we can't do.
That's right.
In fact, when you get to Deuteronomy, that's what Moses is going to say is you can't do this. You were too small. You were too weak. And apart from God, it wasn't a possibility. They were right in that, but they forgot God, like Belinda had said. Luke?
That's exactly what we talked about with Leviticus 26, third blessing, guaranteed. If you'll do these things, if you'll follow them, you will have peace in the land. He would run out of the vision, 100 would run away from your 5. So God had already told them, but again, just have to.
One more mention of one thing in verse 30 of chapter 13 before we get to 14. So first mention of Caleb here. Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it." And so he's gonna debut a little more in chapter 14. But can you imagine the courage it would have taken for him to have? You've got this angry, riotous mob that's just teetering on the edge of throwing off the leadership, and we're going to see the response when he gets a little more vocal. But the courage it takes to stand up against them, I just can't imagine what it must have been like to be the sole voice and the sole spokesman for God to say, "Hey, we can do this. God's with us." You just really have to appreciate Caleb, and you see God and admires him as well when you get into chapter 14.
He knew God was with him,
Yep.
even when he was speaking for God.
That's right.
God even made that clear he was with him.
That's right.
Well,
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, in jumping ahead a little bit in verse 8 of chapter 14, he says, if the Lord delights in us, and Luke, to your point, he did. If the Lord delights in us, then he'll bring us into the land. He knew it wasn't about them. He knew it was about the Lord, and that changed everything. And that's an applicable point to us.
Faith is the difference. Faith or unbelief. And it's, they were told, choose blessing, choose cursing. We have to choose. Are we going to believe God, or are we going to disbelieve God? Are we going to trust in the Lord, or are we going to disbelieve and doubt and complain and rebel? Al?
Yeah, they had forgotten everything that had happened from being delivered from Egypt, crossing the Red Sea, and in everything that they had done, God had been with them and led them correctly. And they just went and throw all that away and just forget it.
And I think that's a good lesson for all of us, because we've all found ourselves in life like the Israelites are here. So we don't need to pretend that we would probably have done much differently. We've had moments of doubting and questioning and complaining and fear where we've been overcome by that. And so the solution to that, we can see this, sitting here amongst our brethren, studying God's word. The solution to that is to remember God's faithfulness. And so just store that in the back of your brain. Next time you're finding yourself wanting to be like the Israelites, remember the faithfulness of God that He's shown to you, because that's how you dispel the fear and the doubt and the anxiety, is to remember God's faithfulness and then to continue in that as well.
Well, and then jumping into chapter 14, you see in those first 4 verses a progression from fear. They weep all night, and then they begin to complain against Aaron and Moses, and saying, even as going as far again to say, it would have been better for us to have died in Egypt. Why'd you bring us here? But
why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? I mean, that's a harsh accusation. They're levying against God. And then our wives and our little ones will become prey. So God has brought us out here to kill us, our wives, and our children.
it is a worst case scenario.
I mean, impugning the character of God. I mean, that's,
Well, and then in verse 4, it hits its
Wow.
pinnacle, and they say, let us select a new leader and return to Egypt. And while, yes, I think they're absolutely talking about Moses and Aaron, by extension, they're also talking about rebelling against God, right?
That's ultimately what it's against.
And so you see that progression that happens very quickly, and then you see God respond accordingly.
Yep. So in the next section, Moses and Aaron, they hit the face. They know what's about to happen. They've seen this before. They know God's going to be upset at the faithlessness of the people. Joshua and Caleb, they try to intercede. They try to encourage the people. And, faith influences our perspective. All 12 of these men went and saw the same thing, but yet they came back with two very different responses. And the difference between Joshua and Caleb and the other 10 was faith. And so the 10 compared themselves to the giants, and Joshua and Caleb compared the giants to their God. And so that completely changed the perspective when you look at it through that lens. So they were ready to go into the land. And they encourage people, verse 9, don't rebel against the Lord. Do not fear the people of the land. Their protection is removed. The Lord is with us. And in verse 10, Israel refuses to listen and is ready to kill them. But God's got something to say about all of this as his glory appears at the tent of meeting, as this rebellion comes to a climax.
I'm going to suggest we skip that question because we got about 4 minutes left.
We don't think we handle it?
I don't think we've made a short time. Well, I think it's my fault.
Let's go. Verses 11 to 12.
All right, so it is interesting that God's ready to destroy them, right? And again,
I think.
But what else could they do, right? I mean, they said, we're rebelling against the Lord. We're rebelling against Moses and Aaron. What else could they do? Let's go back to Egypt. We were better off when we were slaves. And in a real sense, that's exactly what we do when we turn and run back to sin. We choose to do the same thing. But Moses intervenes. And it's interesting that God listens to him, right? What's the crux of Moses' argument to the Lord to not destroy them?
Bring reproach against God. He could not deliver the people that he took out of Egypt.
Right. And God's responsive to that. And you think about how many times in Scripture the Lord listens to the faithful. And again, I think it says something about prayer.
I think it says a lot about Moses' character here. Because if he was an arrogant and prideful man, he would be one of, oh, you're going to make it after me? Yes.
Take him up on that offer.
Well, and I love verse 18 in particular. He quotes
What God quoted to him.
He quotes what God quoted to him back in Exodus 34 when Moses threw down the tablets because of the golden calf. And he reminds the Lord that the Lord is long-suffering and abundant in mercy, forgiving iniquity and transgression. But he by no means clears the guilty, visiting the iniquity on the fathers, on the children, to the third and fourth generation.
And just a reminder, as has been stated multiple times, you see in Moses this picture of Jesus who intercedes for the people and turning down personal glory, turning down personal comfort and blessing and ease for the good of his people. So just again a picture there. Verses 20 through 38, you have God's judgment on disobedience. So it just does not go well for them. He praises Caleb. An interesting statement made about him. We'll talk about Caleb more when we get to the book of Joshua. It says Caleb had a different spirit, and in that he followed God. He trusted in the Lord, followed him fully. And then kind of the sentence is meted out for the people nationally. What was the age of those who were going to be unable to enter the promised land? What age and up? Okay. 20 years old and up. So 19 and under would be able to enter it. And they would wander in the wilderness until they died. We mentioned a bit of the irony. They said, God's brought us out here to kill our wives and our children. And he says, the ones that you said I was going to kill, I'm going to take into the promised land. And then again, the irony of you were there for 40 days. You're going to wander 1 year in the wilderness for each day that you were there in the promised land. So they're going to have to wander for 40 years until this generation, this faithless generation, passes away. And Joshua and Caleb will be the only two from this generation to be able to enter.
I always love looking to Joshua chapter 14, where Caleb received the inheritance and the attitude in which he approaches Joshua. Moses is dead now in Joshua 14. And he comes to Joshua and says, hey, remember what I promised?
I still got some fight in me.
And he still shows his faith, even 40 years later. And God's word is true. Let me have what I was told.
That's a demonstration of his different spirit that he had that set him apart. So the 10 spies that were sent into the land, they were punished. They died before the Lord. So I would like to talk about how leadership is held to a higher standard in God's sight, because as has been mentioned, they were the ones that influenced Israel to doubt the Lord. And finally, is that the last one? Oh, Israel. Yeah, it's just sadly ironic the way this whole event concludes. God tells them they can't go. I'm not going with you. You're going to wander. Well, we're ready to enter now. And so they rally together. They try to make a push to enter the land. Moses sees what they're doing. He says, don't. God's not with you. They do it anyway. They go and engage some of the enemies in battle, and they're defeated. And they were ready to go only after God has told them they can't enter. So if they would have had that same attitude and faith before all of this happened, then would have been a very different outcome. But rather they wait after till God says no, you can't go, and then they try and make a play for the land and are defeated.
I wrote a note made a note in note taking for this that their repentance was like buying white for your flowers the day after your anniversary. It's a little too late. And so they try to go conquer the land, and they're run back interestingly, to Horma, which means utterly destroyed, right? So even the name of their defeat, the city of their defeat, matches with what God promised.
Thank you for your attention and participation in our class.